Okay, hi, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am the Deputy Director and COO for the Tobin Center of Economic Policy at Yale. And together with my colleagues at Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, we're really delighted to welcome you to this exciting webinar. A couple of housekeeping items. As you can see, we are recording this. We will circulate a link after the meeting. We also ask that you stay on mute during the presentation. At the end, we will open it up for questions, and feel free to use the raise your hand or another reaction or emoji of your choice, and we will call on you at that time. And then with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Shagufta Ahmed, who is currently on loan to the Tobin Center from the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And along with Gopi Shagufta, have really pulled this event together. So with that, Shagufta, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the Tobin Center for this opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone, again. Thank you for joining us today. As Michelle mentioned, my name is Shagufta Ahmed, and I am indeed on loan from the White House Information and Regulatory Affairs. But for now, I'm the Senior Policy Fellow leading the Tobin Center's efforts to engage in the federal regulatory system. I've been at OIRA for about 15 years reviewing federal regulations, and it's also where I saw firsthand the role public input can play in the development of federal regulatory policy. The Tobin Center is excited for this important conversation. The center is dedicated to enabling more policy-relevant research at Yale and bringing it to the policy arena, including a powerful but sometimes overlooked and yet often long-lasting vehicle for public policy, federal regulations. We are co-hosting this event today with our colleagues from the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, or SIEPR, to help bring academic expertise to the White House's historic revision, the first revision in 20 years, to the guidance the White House provides to federal agencies for regulatory cost-benefit analysis. This guidance is currently out for public feedback. Both SIEPR and Tobin are committed to promoting evidence-based knowledge in the policy debate. And it's for this very reason, we believe it is critically important for the academic community to participate in this historic revision. Assessing benefits and costs of alternative regulatory options through analysis helps policymakers arrive at sound regulatory decisions. Whether those decisions are about labor or fuel economy standards, or for-profit education accountability metrics, or even medical billing requirements, it also helps the American people, Congress, and the courts understand the effects of those decisions. Careful analysis can make all the difference in shaping sound regulatory outcomes and increasing benefits to society as a whole. That is why it is critical to root these regulatory choices in the best methodological approaches. Through revised guidelines, the White House is seeking to ensure that analytic guidance reflects new developments in economic and other scientific understanding. And this is where academic expertise is absolutely critical. You are all at the front lines of research, honing the technical tools that policymakers rely on to inform the best possible policy approach. And this is why your input is very much needed today. Improvements to this guidance will help facilitate better decision-making and policymaking, which we hope will lead to policy outcomes that improve the well-being of society. But we understand that for most people outside of Washington, the federal regulatory process feels a bit like a black box. It's not always clear how to engage in the regulatory arena and why your input is uniquely valuable. Today's event tries to make this more clear. In this event, we will hear from the experience of Yale and Stanford academics who worked on federal regulations while on assignment to the White House Council of Economic Advisors. We will hear directly from them on the critical role the guidance on cost-benefit analysis played in shaping regulations when they were at the White House. They will also explain what they learned about how economists and the broader academic community can contribute in this area. We will then hear from high-ranking officials from the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs about this historic revision, including key changes being made to this guidance from when this guidance was originally issued in 2003, and where the White House is looking for input, especially from the academic community. And so that we can provide a better understanding of this historic revision, we will also hear about some tangible examples of how federal regulations may change under this new analytic guidance. Finally, we will be opening up the session to questions from our audience. I want to now introduce you to Gopi Shagufta and Ken Gillingham. Gopi is a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. She is also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Society of Actuaries. Gopi also served as a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors from July 2021 to 2022. Ken Gillingham is a professor of economics at Yale University, with appointments at the Yale School of Environment, among other departments. He's an associate editor at the Review of Economics and Statistics and is on the board of Environmental Change in Society at the National Academies. Like Gopi, Ken also served as a senior economist with the White House Council of Economic Advisors, where he was focused on energy and the environment. I want to now turn it over to Gopi.
Thanks so much, Shagufta, and thanks to Michelle and your team for putting this together. So I just wanted to be really brief and just say a little bit about what brought me here to kind of work together with the Tobin Center on this event. Before I spent a year at the CEA, I really had a very naive view of policy. I feel like I thought everything happened through the legislative process, and I came to appreciate just how much happens through the rulemaking and regulatory process. But the other thing, there are two other big lessons from my year in DC, one of which is that the rulemaking process has opportunities for public comment. Most of the organizations that participate in the public comment process are ones with financial stakes in the policy changes that are being made. So maybe trade associations or industry groups, and academics have a relatively small footprint right now in the regulatory process. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is increase that. Because I found that academic input, when it is given, is highly valued in the comment process and can change the course of policy decisions made through the regulatory process. So I had never heard of Circular A4 before I spent a year in DC. And so I recognize it's a very in the weeds kind of memo, but it's in a way the kind of the memo that shapes how a lot of policy is made through the regulatory process, because it influences how cost-benefit analysis is done. And this touches just a variety of different policy areas. If you're interested in virtually any policy area, there's something here that will affect the way that that policy is shaped going forward. And so that's all I wanted to really say. I'm going to come back and we're going to do some Q&A to get a better sense of what is in the changes that are being proposed and where and how input can be most valuable. But I want to pass it over to Ken.
Great. Thanks so much, Gopi, for your remarks, and Shagufta, and for the Tobin Center and SIEPR for hosting this event. I'm a professor of economics at Yale, and as was mentioned, in 2015-16, I was a senior economist for energy and the environment at the CEA. While I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, which you probably all know, but this is kind of intended to be like the internal think tank of economists within the White House, meant to provide economic advice, as well as on a whole variety of different activities, including regulation. During my time, there's a lot of regulatory activity going on. I worked very actively on regulations, reviewing them, providing feedback, occasionally performing some modeling on the side. And like Gopi, I too had never heard of Circular A4 before I was within the Beltway. But it really is a key guidance document that shaped the discussion. And one way to think about it is it provides the framework on how cost-benefit analysis is going to be performed. So all of the work was based around that. It provides guidance on discounting, and in broad strokes about how the analysis should be performed, including what components should be in there in terms of sensitivity analysis or distributional analysis, et cetera. Since leaving, and so I was very active with regulatory activity when I was there, but since leaving the White House, I've also continued participating in the regulatory process. And one of the main ways I've done so is through submitting comments. There's, after a proposed rule, a comment period, which I'm sure you all know. And the comment period is, by law required for large regulations, but by process, it tends to be done also for other things. And there's a comment period for this Circular A4 revision, which is what we're talking about here. And these comments matter, as I've learned. Now, a whole variety of comments can be useful, but comments from experts are especially useful, whether it's a literature review, incisive analysis, or even just broad comments. And they're especially useful if they relate closely to your own expertise, like you missed these papers, or you calculated this object incorrectly. Let me give one quick story. I was working with some data on new vehicles, trying to understand the effect of raising prices on new vehicle sales, and was trying to understand why a rulemaking that was a proposed rule was coming up with what seemed to be very large elasticities. And so I was talking to Jim Stock, who is a colleague I work with quite a bit, about this, and it was a time series econometric problem. And Jim said, that doesn't look quite right either. So we ran back, we realized that they were using quarterly data and they were not adjusting for the quarterly data. It was totally an honest error by some folks who didn't mean to be making this mistake, but they forgot to divide by 4. An error like that could easily be missed. And the people at OIRA, the people in the White House work very, very hard to try to catch these, but it sometimes really comes to the broader community to catch errors like this. Obviously, it could be fixed afterwards in the final rule. That's just one example of a helpful comment, but other comments about just broadly, do you think that this is going in the right direction? Are you missing something? Also can be very, very, very helpful. So at that, I'm going to stop, and I really want to pass it to Sam and Dom, who have a lot more to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken, and thank you for your and Gopi's valuable insights. I wanted to offer just a little bit of context. So OIRA, the office that we keep mentioning, is the White House office, the central office in the White House that oversees the review of federal agency regulations before they're essentially enacted or law. I wanted to turn it over to Sam Berger and Dom. Just as background, Sam is the associate administrator for OIRA. He also happens to be a Yale Law School alumnus. And also Don Mancini, who's the deputy director of OIRA and also in his past life a practicing economist. So I wanted to turn it over to Sam and Dom for their presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Shagufta, and thanks really for organizing. This is it's great to have an opportunity to talk to you all. And before we get into the details, I think the thing that I would most like to stress is we really want to hear your comments on A4. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of what can be most helpful, but the point as we sort of were getting at, Circular A4 is the document that provides guidance to agencies on conducting regulatory impact analyses, basically benefit cost analysis on regulations. It was issued in 2003 and hasn't been updated since. And as you all know better than me, a lot has changed in the field since then. And so this set of updates seeks to address changes, areas, and areas in which A4 has been less effective, to try and update those as well. But what we're trying to do is reflect the state of the field. And to do that, we need to hear from folks that are in the field, which is you all. And so your input, your feedback through the comment process is incredibly important. So maybe we'll talk just a little bit about the comment process first, and then we can turn to kind of the substance of what's going on in Circular A4. But as mentioned, Circular A4 is undergoing a comment. It's not a rule. It is guidance to agencies, but we are undertaking public comment because we want to hear from you all. It's also undergoing peer review, which will be happening relatively simultaneously. And so the input both from peer review and from commenters will be critical in shaping what A4 looks like. And I think the good thing here is, I know sometimes you may hear from folks that say, oh, can you sort of translate what you're doing into a manner in which lay people will understand, or this audience will understand, or that audience will understand. In this case, you can view your audience as your fellow economists. So the types of things that you would say that you think would motivate your colleagues to change their mind or to adopt your point of view would be the kind of thing that would be helpful for us to hear. The sorts of citations that you would provide to support your work, that's exactly what we want. The format in which you would share things, that sounds great. And generally speaking, the key thing for us is just to please put it into our comment process, by which I mean, if you write a wonderful paper, give a wonderful talk, write a wonderful blog post, please don't assume that we're going to see it. Please just take it and put it into our comment process. You don't have to change it at all, although you can if you want. The real key is to get it into the comment process. Do you want to send lit review? I can't remember if someone mentioned that. Great. All of this sort of stuff. The beauty of this is, think about how you are having a spirited discussion with your colleagues, you would want to convince them that you were right. That's the kind of stuff that's really useful for us to hear. In addition, it's really useful for us to hear things that you think we got correct, by which I mean, don't just jump to the areas that you would improve. Because as you might imagine, there are a lot of changes over the last 20 years. Some things that will seem perhaps quite straightforward and obvious to you at this point are, for us, quite a big change because we haven't been doing it for 2 decades. And so starting even with a couple paragraphs that say the following parts look great, or, are part of the, sort of consistent with state art in the field, and then, getting on to 8 or 10 pages of things that you would improve, those couple paragraphs are still incredibly valuable for us, because otherwise we would only hear from potentially the subset of folks that don't like what we're doing or have concerns. And if the vast majority of people think we got it right, it's good for us to know that when we're considering comments and how to make changes consistent with that. So before we get to the substance, I'm going to stop there and see if Dom could add some additional context about engaging with our process and what would be most useful.
I think that's I think you got the basics right, Sam. I think when is the comment period open till? I believe June 6th.
June 6th.
And so that's one piece of information that we should have. And so and I will also, the other thing, context I was maybe to give, because this audience may have a perspective on this that most don't, is that we do have requirements under the statute by which we issue this guidance to conduct peer review. There's also some general guidance under the Information Quality Act on peer review. It's different than academic peer review. It's it's more of a solicitation of expert opinion from a subset of the community, and we're in the process of actually just this week, literally, we just got the green light to start choosing that process. And so we are obliged to address and look at the peer review, but there's nothing that's has magic about it. Like a detailed, persuasive public comment can be just as effective as something we hear from our peer reviewers in terms of influence on the final product. So, but there will be a separate process for that, and if you follow this or care, eventually once the final goes out, there'll probably be a separate discussion of how we address peer review comments.
Great. So maybe we'll take just a couple minutes to talk a little bit about the substance, recognizing that there are a large number of parts of circular 4, as you might imagine, for a document that is providing guidance on regulatory cost benefit analysis. So a couple big things that I would say. I'll touch on a few, and then I'm sure Dom will have a couple that he would add as well. So I think one of the things that we anticipate receiving a lot of attention has to do with the discount rate, which is basically how you get a present value for future costs and benefits. And so under the existing A4, we have 2 different discount rates, 3%, and then also a 7% rate, which is intended to deal with capital effects. In the proposal, we take the existing formula that 20 years ago arrived at 3%, and using the same data while incorporating TIPS, which was established in 2002, so they really haven't when it was coming out in 2003, but using basically the same formula of 30-year average of 10-year treasury notes minus CPI inflation, we get a discount rate of 1.7. The other big change is that in Circular A4, we had always discussed the shadow price approach as the analytically preferred method, a way to address. And there's been a lot of concern around the 7% approach in general. And so in the proposal, we suggest accounting for capital effects with a shadow price of capital adjustment. And then we account for risk with certainty equivalent values. But in essence, it operates as a sort of sensitivity analysis. And where it's identified that capital effects can be meaningful, agencies are encouraged them to do kind of a deeper dive, looking at things like incidence and the like. Another area that we anticipate receiving a fair bit of attention are some of the updates to distributional analysis. So Circular 4 has always directed agencies to account for distributional effects, but we provide additional guidance to help agencies when thinking that through. There's not something that's required, but it's something that agencies may want to do in certain circumstances. Among the things that we talk about, one is making clear that you may like have a distributional interest could lead an agency to select a regulatory alternative with lower monetized net benefits over one with higher monetized net benefits because of the difference in how those are distributed. So you could imagine a circumstance in which you're targeting a program, say, to help low-income folks. If 90% of the benefits under alternative A actually go to high-income folks, you have slightly smaller net benefits under alternative B, but 80% of those go to the population you're targeting. An agency, would likely choose B because it's better getting at what they're trying to accomplish with the regulation. The other thing that is new, something that would be done for the first time, is to account for diminishing marginal utility through a constant elasticity of marginal utility of income estimate, basically acknowledging that $1,000 means has more significance to folks making the median income than it would to somebody making $50 million a year. We go into that in some more measure of depth. It's one part of a set of analyses that an agency might do, but that is kind of a significant new thing in the proposal. Other sorts of things we do are things that might to you all seem relatively straightforward given advances in the field over the subsequent 2 decades since 2003, but including dealing with behavioral biases and nudges, eliminating a direction to assume individuals are risk neutral. We expand the discussion on market power and competition, including how it can manifest in non-price ways. There's a lot more, and Dom, you may want to pick a couple of your favorites to flag for folks as well. But suffice it to say, it is almost certainly the case that if there's an area of policy that you're interested in and that policy involves regulation, that a change in A4 in the proposed revisions to A4 could impact how agencies analyze a regulation in that space. But let me turn over to Dom to talk a little bit. We'll both correct anything I said, but also add some more of his own thoughts on A4.
Sure. Great. I will expand on a little bit of maybe talking about what the circular does and what it doesn't, and then maybe also if anyone has any thoughts or questions, I wouldn't mind people jumping in at any time with a raised hand. But in the meantime, and it's both like take the discount rates, for instance. There's both an embedded technical analysis. We talk about different ways of, even in literature review, looking at different estimates of the shadow price and when it might be appropriate, but there are also kind of choices in there. And there are choices like the following that will be just as interesting for us to get input onto, which is like when we say we would like to base a social rated time preference, well, there's the data set. We do make a choice that we actually like it based on actual data that we can observe. And so we can tell the public we're observing this data set, and we are actually making a choice that we are looking for a descriptive social rated time preference versus a more normative social discount rate that can be in sense. And that's just the nature of how cost benefit analysis works for regulatory impacts. We do think as a matter of course, we generally look for it being a descriptive measure of costs and benefits versus like having any embedded social goals within the analysis itself. If that makes sense. Almost all these choices have a similar tenor to it. For instance, in the distributional thing, we do understand that there's a diversity of views in the literature about the use of distributional weights and using the marginal elasticity of marginal utility. I tell you about a practice with this. But we also make a normative choice within the draft A4 that we would allow the agency to consider this, but we're not requiring it at this time. So we're also really getting your input about the state of the literature and the state of potential consensus or controversy within the literature could inform both of those our technical analysis, but also what we ultimately choose is kind of what's mandatory versus allowed versus discouraged at this point in time. So I just want to give you a nature of what A4 is actually doing. And maybe I'll stop with a few other elaborations of some things that are in A4. Again, love to hear, because we also may be jumping into examples here for how it can make a difference. So we do, the previous version of A4 talks a lot about the scope of the analysis across time and space, and talking about how the analysis should be done from the perspective of citizens and residents of the United States. We have long in practice recognized that that is actually sometimes difficult to ascertain, given the complicated nature of the modern economy. You all well know, and the instance from something as simple as U.S. residents living abroad to something more complicated about looking at the impact of, say, a mobile source regulation on Toyota. We've never tried to parse the incidence of a foreign-owned corporation to domestic versus, and so in practice, it's always been more complicated. We do have some more sophisticated discussion, we hope, about agency considerations on when they're considering expanding the analysis beyond the borders of the United States. Obviously, this could be very important for the greenhouse gas regulation, although technically right now, this federal government, the EPA has a proposed approach to a new version of the social cost of greenhouse gases. The guidance that applies to across the federal government, we called it an interim approach a couple of years ago, is a global number. And we've long used that. And really the discussion in A4 is meant to kind of bring the considerations that we've always had about whether the use of the global number is the correct one into larger discussions of analysis and potentially outside of climate change. Something maybe less interesting to the economics, maybe the administrative law crowd would like this, is that we do have a discussion about baselines, because if you think about it, all these regulations are done through authority given to them by a statute, and the extent of the discretion that the statute gives the agency could have an effect on the amount of analysis that's done. The current A4 says that, well, if you pass a new statute, you should use a pre-statutory baseline to capture the full effects of the potential policy change, the source coming from Congress or the agency. We do talk about more circumstances in which a post-statutory baseline could be appropriate, basically if there's little or no discretion exercised by the agency itself. That is actually, from an economic perspective and how you conduct the analysis, is a big deal, but maybe not from a theory standpoint. There are many other things that we talk a little bit more about how transfers. We've always had a separate discussion of economic transfers, but as you increase the potential depth and nature of your discussion of distributional effects, transfers could actually become more important in analyzing regulatory alternatives. And this is, I'll use my first example. If you start looking at distribution and transfers, environmental policies have an incidence that are, notwithstanding, the modeling could, depending on the modeling you could do, the true incidence could land in any particular case in a particular way. But in general, energy efficiency regulations, they tend to be on the lower priced articles in the market. And so if you think about distributional effects, you may be spending a little bit more time on potentially the impact on that lower income community versus, say, a mobile source regulation. Lots of evidence about how mobile source pollution is actually, there's a big equity component to that. And when you think about who is actually exposed at the roadsides more often than not. And so really the goal here is trying to give the agencies the framework to think more deeply about who is benefited and who is hurt from their regulations. And again, as Sam mentioned, we're not actually dictating the agency. Like I said, we haven't decided you shall always do a distributional analysis under certain circumstances. We aren't being that prescriptive there, but otherwise giving the agencies the tools and signaling that we are serious about their analysis of distribution, where it will be very important for the decision making. And this is also a proposal. And we could decide to get more or less prescriptive upon public comment and peer review. And I think those are really most of the large ones. We decided deliberately, at least for this proposal, not to really touch too much the kind of the nitty-gritty of how to measure benefits and costs and monetize, for instance, the value of statistical life, that kind of literature. But more than welcome to getting comment on those. But we kind of made a deliberate decision that we're where we're not like, that wasn't one of the big things that we opened up. But again, if we get if the public comment or peer reviewers, if we get a waterfall of support for thinking seriously about making bigger changes in that area, we're certainly open to it. And then a couple lots of other cats and dogs about giving the agencies practical advice. For instance, if you do a health effect that has a cessation lag, what are some good default assumptions in that area? How to measure risk preferences if you're looking at trying to adjust things for risk neutrality, both at a societal level and an individual level, when to use potential private discount rates, when you know that individuals have their own potentially much higher than social time preference in particular situations. All that is in the very large 94-page document with accompanying preamble. And I think that's more than enough information to maybe turn it back over to the host and start taking questions.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. And thanks, Sam, for laying that out. So unless you had any other illustrative examples, Dom, I'm happy to open it up for questions. I know that there was already a question that Christian Gollier had on the screen, or rather through the chat function. Did you want to ask your question first?
Yes, thank you very much. There is another circular A94 which suggests in the appendix that the discount rate should be 2.8%, which they had 1.7%, which is in the A4, to 1.1% for the average aggregate risk premium, something like that. So what's the link between the two draft circulars?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then Dom, feel free to jump in. And so for folks that are just finding out about A4 for the first time and may not know what A94 is, A94 is another circular which deals with federal spending. So A4 deals with cost-benefit analysis in the context of regulations. A94 deals with cost-benefit analysis in the context of spending programs. And I'll just say that A94 is not an OIRA document. Now that you all are expected to follow all the ins and outs of internal kind of OMB organization, but that one is handled by our economic policy team. And so while Dom and I can talk a little bit about it, they're really the ones that would be in best position. But both of these documents are undergoing public comment at the same time, and both as a first review in quite some time, and there is a lot of similarity between the approaches. However, there are some differences in terms of the two approaches, and I think with respect to your question, A94 talks about some of the differences that you see in the spending context, including differences in the fact that that regulations frequently have a social insurance function, which may impact kind of the relationship between impacts on the overall economy and impacts on the cost and benefits in the regulatory context. But A94. And I apologize, I can't off the top of my head remember the exact footnote, does talk a little bit about why in that context there's an additional risk premium that is not additional, but a risk premium that's added. Dom, I don't know if there's anything else that you would want to add on that.
I do know that this is an area where there's probably a lot of different thoughts and opinions about how to do that, and we're certainly open to. If you feel that the two circulars, again, I can't speak for the A94 as fluently as I can for A4, but I would also mention that when we've talked about the defaults that we have for the shadow prices, also encouraging the agencies to dig into that more completely and think about their certainty equivalent. So I do think that there's a question about whether the guidance generally is based on the same thing. And then there's also, I think would be very interesting to think about whether a particular investment, whether pursued through a government spending program versus a regulation would have similar discount rates in practice if an agency looked at the risk profile of a particular investment. So I actually think that would be a very interesting thing to get feedback on too. And again, I think the goal is generally yes, that there should be some sort of indifference. I mean, taking portfolio effects aside, perhaps, if you're thinking about that. But that would be interesting feedback we would like to get.
May I add one question or more substantial question? Okay, thank you. So you know we have the asset pricing puzzles in finance theory. It happened that your projects would do to use the risk-free rates database, the market-based, combined with the risk premium based on the model in a certainty equivalent. So you mix two different approaches, and there is a risk of incoherence. That is, you know, on one side you take market data, and so you use a relatively small interest rate compared to what a typical model would generate. And on the other side, you use a certainty equivalent, which tend to underestimate quite vastly the risk premium that you would observe on market, this famous 7% that you got in 2003. So there is a tension there. I'm happy to see that compared to what you did 20 years ago, you offer a solution where there would be risk-specific discounting system through this certainty equivalence of specific project. But at the same time, I'm stressed by the fact that you will probably underestimate the risk, the value of risk, the price of risk by using the certainty equivalent. So I hope that you will provide some guidance in which this underestimation will not materialize. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so can I, on that point, I just think this is also really useful to say that, because I think we were talking a little bit about the range of comments that are helpful. So obviously comments that say you took approach A that has the following problems, you should instead do approach B, or even you took approach A and it would be better if you took approach A prime are helpful. But equally helpful if you say, look, I get it, you're taking these two approaches, this is an improvement over what you did before, but I'm concerned that this will be X, Y, and Z, so can you elaborate so that you don't get into that kind of a problem, is an extremely helpful thing for us to know as well. Or as Dom said, things where you'd say, oh, you've recommended that agencies consider, but you should strongly encourage or require, or you've required it, but you should instead encourage them. Like so it doesn't have to be solely the actual basis itself, but sort of how it's applied in practice. And I think, you know, we all recognize that there can be limitations to various approaches. And so if you have thoughts on ways to address those limitations within the overall framework, that's incredibly helpful. And I think one other thing that I would mention is, in addition to the draft text, the proposed revisions to A4 itself, we also have a preamble document, which kind of goes through some of the changes and draws out questions where we think that comment would be particularly helpful. Now, that certainly isn't those aren't the only things that we'll consider, and would strongly encourage you to comment on anything that you would want to. But if you have limited resources and you're looking at 5 things and trying to figure out which one you want to say, and 3 of them are listed in the preamble, you may want to choose those 3 first and then turn to the other 2. Of course, you don't have to, but it's just those are circumstances where it's tried to call out instances in which we recognize either some measure of tension or where further information would be really helpful in trying to choose the exact approach utilized in A4. Dom, I didn't know if there's anything you wanted to add on.
Thank you.
Just a really brief interjection, Christian, on your first question about circular A94 as opposed to A4. A94 has usually kind of been a little bit on the back burner, with A4 playing the bigger role, but with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a lot of government spending that's going to be guided by A94 that makes A94, it was always relevant, but it's particularly relevant in the next few years.
And the further complicated things, I would mention that in the spending world, and when it gets to kind of in the like say CMS or something like that, those are spending programs that are actually issued for regulation, and so those tend to be annual programs where the discount rates aren't driving a huge amount of decision making. But there's also, in practice, you know, we have to have the discussion about if there's a multi-year program, which discount rate to use, and hopefully, like I said, in practice, it won't be inconsistent.
Great. Were there other questions? I have a question, but before I offer my question, I wanted to see if there was any questions, burning questions from others. Okay, well, Sam and Dom, thank you. Now that I'm in this role, I have a question for both of you. So Ken earlier mentioned that the Biden executive order modernizing regulatory review made a few notable changes. One of the changes was revising the threshold for significant regulations, which then triggers this requirement to do a more fulsome or elaborate cost-benefit analysis. One of the prongs of significant regulations that people often forget is this other aspect in Executive Order 12866, which was also maintained in the new regulatory modernization executive order, is this threshold of review and more extensive regulatory cost-benefit analysis for anything that triggers what's considered adverse effect in a material way to the economy, to productivity, to competition in particular, along with jobs and the environment. So question for you with respect to the existing A4 and the modified A4. What does the revised A4 say with respect to guidance provided to federal agencies in the evaluation of market power and in terms of competition? And what do you think the academics and the research community can offer in that specific area? I know if I was wearing my OIRA hat, we were always asking, what is the scholarship, what does the literature say in this specific sector that we can use to really further tease out those impacts and really make that more transparent and make a more informed decision for regulators?
Dom, do you want to take that first, or do you want to?
Sure, I'll give it a shot because, I think that I would say that there's probably not, we do have an expanded discussion of in the need for the regulation of market power. There's probably not what we would consider kind of step-by-step guidance on how to consider market power and competition in a particular regulation. I do think that we're thinking hard about that. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I think that's probably besides like really putting more of a bright light on it, that we still know that we have a little work to do to get to a particular competition analysis of particular regulation. I will say that as Shagufta probably knows, I would think that those regulations are actually very likely to hit the 3F1 significance threshold anyway, because that is a benefits, costs, or transfers of $200 million in any 1 year. It's although we doubled it, and I will say that's that was a notable change that from the perspective of many of the regulations that we care about, that is the impacts will be well above that threshold. And so I would assume that it's very going to be seldom case where we would be parsing our certificates to say there's only a competition effect versus other parts of A4 as well.
Yeah, I think one thing I would just add to what Dom mentioned was, while there is a more extensive discussion of market effects in circular A4, as Dom alluded to, we're continuing to examine how to provide further guidance to agencies. So I would say, even if you're looking at that section and think, well, you haven't really gotten this at all, but you should really address X, Y, and Z. That's very useful to provide to us, even if it ends up not being in A4, it could inform subsequent guidance that elaborates on aspects of that. And so would certainly encourage folks, and obviously there's been a lot of progress and advances in the field there. And so, sharing your insights and thoughts could be quite useful, even if it doesn't quite fit into the existing framework in which we discuss competition, meaning that it seems to be at a level of depth and granularity that isn't consistent with the rest of that section. It could still be quite useful, and would certainly encourage folks to provide that to us. As I'm sure you're all aware, the administration has made competition a central focus. And there's a whole competition council, of which OIRA is a part, looking to take steps across the board to improve the ways in which we can make markets more competitive. So would certainly welcome any thoughts on that.
Great, thank you, Sam and Dom. I wanted to see if my colleagues Gopi or Ken had any specific questions for Sam and Dom, given their unique experience. I guess not. And any one of our colleagues on the call?
I was going to actually provide a couple more examples, if that would be
fantastic.
helpful. Okay, so look, I know we've talked about a lot of there's the formal cost benefit analysis, and talking about the Calder-Hicks criteria and optimal net benefits, when we might not use that, when we might, how to measure things. But I think A4 also serves as kind of a discipline guide, even when you're kind of given a statute that isn't really, you're not really supposed to make decisions based on that. There are many statutes where you're allowed to or required to, but there are other statutes that kind of define things. For instance, the American with Disabilities Act define a certain, right to access. The overtime regulations define salary thresholds and duties in order for a person to be considered an hourly employee for the purposes of overtime. There are a lot of regulations. I dare say I haven't actually done a tally of this, but I'd say at least maybe almost as many as there are. That it's more like just understanding the market and understanding how to measure things versus making decisions based on a formal cost benefit analysis framework with the net benefits of different alternatives. The overtime one, which gets a lot of attention, is maybe a good example in that. In case people don't know, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, certain employees that are non-professional employees are entitled to time and a half overtime over 40 hours of work per week. There's many variations and complications on that in case you're familiar with it. I know I'm simplifying. Traditionally, Department of Labor, for administrative ease, maybe for, just officially, they've actually set a salary threshold below which your job is inherently non-managerial. And so that means that the structure of the labor market actually is reflective of these regulations pretty largely, because it's about the duties and whether you have independent judgment and you're a member of a professional. So those who have even hire your fellows, I know this has come up in CEA in the past, how many annual fellows they could have based on the current and future overtime regulations. Just understanding the market, understanding the nature of the labor performed by different people in different parts of the country is hugely important to that regulation, even though it's outside of the, we still look to try to formalize the cost benefit analysis to the extent we can, but it's really about, do you understand what you're doing with these different options? And there's not really a cumulative net benefits framework on that. Similar to the gainful employment rule that we just concluded a review on, the statute actually defines that, this is Shagufta smiling because she's a longtime education desk officer as well in OIRA. The statute defines that a university, in order to be eligible for federal funding, has to provide their graduates with gainful employment. Again, it's a very similar situation in which, well, what does that mean? How do you measure that? What are the statistics that you bring to bear? I know I haven't been as involved in the weeds, being the kicked upstairs over the past few years, but during the Obama administration's consideration of this, DA was incredibly involved in how to understanding the market for college education. So again, there are parts of A4, like we have gone about the highlights, but there are a lot of, it's a long document with a lot of technical guidance for how to measure things. In both these instances, we actually take comment on whether we should actually expand that type of analysis, just more of like, if something has a cost or a transfer that's affecting a certain part of the labor market or certain industries, like should we provide more guidance on discipline guidance for how the agency should do that? So I just wanted to not lose sight of that it tries to wear many hats. Some may be arguably more successfully than others, but we do provide it as a more general guidance for even just for disciplined decision making in the agencies, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Dom. I also have an example. I think that there's another aspect of A4, from what I understand, that's being revised. And I wanted to put it in the context of fee disclosures. So if you're thinking about the industry like banking or airline industry who sets out or charges fees in ways that are difficult for consumers to really anticipate when they're planning their purchases. From what I understand, the current A4 guidelines, the emphasis is more on the resource effects related to those fees. So for example, businesses determine whether to adjust their pricing structure and implementing a more transparent pricing scheme. That's more of what's contemplated in the current A4, and which means consumers are potentially spending less time searching for goods, because direct comparisons are that much more simpler. And there's obviously an impact on consumer and producer surplus in terms of the changes associated with purchasing. But from what I understand from the new proposed A4 changes, there's more of an emphasis on distributional consequences and distributional impacts, as Sam and Dom mentioned and others have mentioned. For example, to what extent will the transaction prices change, and who are the ultimate winners and losers in that change? So versus consumers versus the owners of the companies themselves, and how these effects vary across various types of individuals, whether they're relatively wealthy individuals or households or poorer households. I understand that that federal agencies and the proposed A4 revisions are encouraged to incorporate insights from behavioral economics to inform consumer responses and to better model uncertainty regarding policy implementation. So all of those issues, all of those topics are ripe for comment in the proposal, and we really look forward to having this community engage on those topics in particular. So with that, I wanted to thank everyone, unless there's any last breaking questions. I want to thank Sam, Berger, and Don Mancini. I know you're incredibly busy, and Sam's dealing with a sick child. We very much appreciate him joining us today. And Ken and Gopi, thank you so much for your valuable insights. And in terms of today's discussion and how the academic community can be very valuable in this conversation, not just today, but going forward. As a reminder, the deadline for comments on the proposed revision is June 6th, but just want to make sure everyone is aware the federal government issues regulations practically every day. And so every day you have an opportunity to engage in the federal regulatory process through federalregister.gov. We very much encourage you not to just stop today with this proposed revision, but to continue providing your expertise in other venues and other regulations that essentially become law without your input if you don't engage. Thank you to the Tobin Center and to SIEPR, and thank you for everyone for joining us today.